American Fugitive, as described by its creators Fallen Tree Games, is a modern take on sandbox action, offering a new 3D, top-down, open-world single-player experience inspired by classic GTA. Is it? Let's discuss. American Fugitive is a 3D top-down open-world game set in the 1980s. It follows the story of Will Riley, a man that is framed for the murder of his father and breaks out of prison to clear his name. American Fugitive story is told through short missions you do for various people like your brother Dwayne and some woman that randomly pops up named Anna. There's some shooting, there's some walking, there's some driving, and of course you have to do all this while avoiding the police. Really, it does feel sort of like a Grand Theft Auto game. However, American Fugitive lacks a little bit of that spice that makes Grand Theft Auto a notable series. Before we talk about the parts of American Fugitive that I don't like, let's go over some of its good qualities. First, I think the art direction does a great job of blending retro themes with modern graphics. One of the things a lot of games set in this time like to do is just go full retro and make it look like a game made in the 80s or 90s. While it does work for a lot of them, I really appreciate American Fugitive's deviation from the norm. The lighting effects and blending of textures looks amazing, but it still has an 80s vibes without resorting to throwing the game into a VHS filter. The world is well decorated and the character portraits are pleasant to look at. Another thing I enjoyed is American Fugitive's expansion to the Grand Theft Auto experience. They could have just come out with a relative copy of the first two games, but Fallen Tree really turned American Fugitive into its own game. They threw in some of the adventure elements like player upgrades and an inventory system. They allow you to enter at virtually every building in the game with a break-in system that breaks up the gameplay from the standard 3D top-down mode. You can hold up stores, rob houses, and restrain people to keep them from calling the police. Overall, these elements make the game stand out from just being a spiritual successor to the Grand Theft Auto, and allow American Fugitive to craft its own experience. However, there's a lot of flaws within the game. I know it's not fair to compare this game to Grand Theft Auto because they're made by completely different people. Fallen Tree Games is a small indie studio, and Rockstar is a AAA giant responsible for some of history's largest entertainment releases and releasing games that make $1 billion in a matter of days. However, I think it's fair enough to at least make a passing comparison when the game's promotional media says it's inspired by the series. Let's start with the story, and fair warning, there are some spoilers that will pop up here. American Fugitive starts off with you escaping prison and teaming up with your brother Dwayne, who is more concerned with the McCoys than with who killed your father. I don't know why anytime a narrative needs a rival family, they're always either a Hatfield or McCoy, but that doesn't really matter that much. Within a couple missions, you meet Anna, who's the thief that offers you to help you find the killer of your father, and she hits on you and sends you off to find clues that lead your investigation. After that, I honestly can't explain anything else except for the ending when you find out that Anna's family, or her in particular, killed your father. The reason being is that American Fugitive's story is so dumb and convoluted that I really can't make out an actual storyline. Most of the game shuffles you between people that Anna has you meet that start out good and either end up to be bad or end up dead. Each person adds maybe 1% of the explanation of what actually happened before they hurriedly send you off to the next contact who does the same thing. The problem is most of the information that people give you goes absolutely nowhere, to the point that my brain just got tired of figuring it out after a while. I guess if you walk it backwards it makes sense. Anna's family is just using you to take out people that have caused them issues by saying that it's helping you get closer to your father's killer. Don Vito in the final mission puts most of it together, but it's still just a really clumsy story. It doesn't really explain why you in particular, or what the end goal of their plan really was. There's no closure or satisfying ending except for just shooting Will and Anna, and overall it's one of those stories that are drawn out for absolutely forever, then awkwardly wrapped up in the last 1% or so. It didn't really feel thoroughly thought out, and even if it wasn't so convoluted, it still wasn't interesting. After a while, I was just kind of waiting for it to wrap up because I was getting fed up and bored of the random twists and the now you have to go do stuff for this person turns. I don't really like evaluating a game's story completely on its narrative. There are tons of games out there that are honestly poorly written, but fun enough to just turn your brain off and enjoy. American Fugitive isn't one of those games. Honestly, the story's gameplay is closer to being a DHL employee than a fugitive. Every mission can be summed up as take this thing and put it here, to the point that there's an actual mission where you're literally just moving boxes around. Sometimes it's a body, sometimes it's a car, sometimes it's a person. While there's different ways you have to obtain the items, and by that I mean the only different ways are carjackings, beating people up, or just finding the items, there are really no variations to the missions. They are all, except for maybe 3 or 4 missions, standard templated fetch quests. The missions are super easy as well, as long as they're working. Most of the time there's no combat involved, and doing things like a carjacking is pretty easy. You don't really face any challenges in the missions, which makes it feel more like a postal service job. Sometimes you might have to hold up a store and the random number generator will screw you over, but you can spend your money and upgrade points right beforehand to improve your chances. The only time things get difficult is when they're broken. For any game that involves being a criminal, it's a staple to have some sort of police or one-in-level system that brings the police to you when you do crimes. Usually it's straightforward and simple to understand. In Grand Theft Auto, don't kill anyone near the police or hit a cop car. In Payday, make sure the alarms are disabled and nobody can see you sneaking around. They can be wonky sometimes, but for the most part, they work. American Fugitive's police system is completely broken. For the most part in games, police don't get dispatched to story events, except in cases where they're supposed to. In American Fugitive, it works the same way sometimes. Every now and then you'll have to fight a group of people or beat somebody up in a somewhat secluded area. Generally, the police won't show up to those events, but sometimes they do. You'll be fighting people by hand in a closed-off sports complex, and the cops will spawn inside the fences and start shooting at you. You'll be out in a gunfight in the middle of nowhere with a rival gang, and the police will show up next to you and start shooting at you. It's inconsistent to the point that I've looked up gameplay for a mission that I've done and seen the exact opposite happen for other people. It's generally assumed that if they see you doing something the game deems illegal, like property damage, trespassing, or hitting another vehicle, they'll come after you. However, it never really works right. I've hit cop cars and had nothing happen. I've ran over things in front of them and had nothing happen. Then sometimes I'll do something minor with nobody around and they'll come after me. There's also some weird things that happen when you're wanted. If you fail to stop, you get an increased wanted level, which makes sense. However, I really can't tell a difference in wanted levels. Cops don't spawn or respawn in the same way that games like GTA do, and if you drive away fast enough, you usually just won't even see them on higher levels. Usually getting away at higher levels becomes more impossible, but I really can't tell a difference in American Fugitive. All you have to do is change clothes without them looking, or get into a new car, and they'll stop looking for you. If you do something on foot and get into a car, you can just drive the car for a while and they'll forget about you, because you'll start cooling down. The same thing happens if you get out of a wanted car. They only recognize the single entity that did the crime and not the relationship between your player and the entity. Also, if you want an easy way out of the wanted level, just stop the car until the cops get out onto the road, then drive into the woods and wait about a minute or two. You don't even have to really go that far for them to be completely unable to find you. Or actually, just run into the woods. You can run a lot faster than they can. I found myself doing these things a lot on the later islands because stealing a car takes too long and there's not a lot of clothes around. In a way, the police system makes sense, but it's more of a nuisance than anything. When I'd have to avoid them after a minor fender bender turned into a 3-star pursuit, it really brought the entire game to a halt. When you're trying to fight a small group of people and you have 3 to 4 cops on you constantly, it's just irritating. It'd be different if the system actually worked and if it were difficult to get away from the police. I would either have fun evading them or would have to resort to being more careful to not piss them off. However, in their current state, it's more like staying in a room infested by fleas. Annoying enough you don't like it, but not really life-threatening. There's also a couple of other minor bugs in the game. For example, I had an issue where the game spawned a vehicle that I had to get into for a mission that I couldn't restart on top of a vehicle that I was already driving, which caused it to flip over and I spent 5 minutes trying to get it upright. There's also a more major issue of enemies just randomly not taking damage from direct hits, which is extremely annoying, but an issue that the developers apparently know about and are working on. Issues aside, a lot of the gameplay is just boring. Robbing houses is fun, but there's not that much of an incentive to do it. Most of the missions don't involve combat, and even when they do, it's not difficult, so money isn't extremely important. The metal detector for stashes, the auto casing ability, and health regen are good to have, but they're not extremely expensive. Most of the other abilities aren't really necessary. Buying cars isn't required because it's easy to not get caught, and even then they're extremely cheap to buy, and ammo and weapons are cheap and usually not needed. All you can really get out of houses is stuff to pawn, and if there's no reason to have a lot of money, you really don't have a reason to rob them. The police system is annoying and broken enough that it'd be irritating to kill the 2 civilians walking around in hopes of a standoff. A firefight with the cops is extremely easy to win and get out of, and currently annoying because they usually won't take damage, so it's not fun to go on a rampage. There's time trials around the town you can do, but a lack of a mini-map makes them a pain to complete, and also a pain to get around and to get familiar with the town, and I just didn't find them fun. There's collectibles like flyers and stashes to find, but I don't find collectibles to ever really be engaging enough to consider actual gameplay. And finally, there's jumps you can do, but they also just feel like padding. To go back to the question of whether or not American Fugitive feels like a spiritual successor to Grand Theft Auto, the answer to me is kind of, but not really. I never played the first two games it was based off of, but I did spend a lot of time in GTA 3, San Andreas, and 4. Even though they were a different format, the Grand Theft Auto series as a whole had characteristics that made them notable. The stories were usually engaging. The missions, while usually fetch quests, would have something go wrong or a slightly different element that made them fun to play. The worlds were immersive, the characters were vibrant and unforgettable. They weren't always perfect, but they left an impression. American Fugitive doesn't really have anything like that. Its story is convoluted and forgettable with characters that don't stand out. Its gameplay is generic and lacks really anything fun or exciting to hook you with. Parts of it are broken, or at the very least, boring. For the first couple of hours it's not that much of a bother, but by the time you get to the 8 or 9 hours required to complete the story, the game's a drag. You do the same templated quests over and over and over again while listening to the same 4 actually not really bad songs on repeat, hoping for an interesting revelation that never comes. Finally, you go off on one final, pretty generic mission for an abrupt ending that makes you feel like you wasted the last 9 hours of your life. You also can't take solace in an immersive open world. There are things you can do, but with no real incentive behind them or considerable benefit for completing them, there's really nothing you can do. American Fugitive's bugs makes the game annoying enough that it's not really fun, but not frustrating enough to actually make you upset. But at the end of the day, it looks nice, I guess. American Fugitive puts itself in the weird middle spot on the quality spectrum. Honestly, there isn't a substantial number of positive features that I could use to call the game good. Conversely, there aren't enough game-breaking issues that I could use to argue that the game is bad. Really, I would call it meh. Not a game I would urge everyone to go out and buy, but also not a part of my library I'm ashamed of. If I wasn't reviewing the game and looking to give it a fair shake, I would have probably quit after 4 or 5 hours, but out of boredom over anger. In my opinion, I would say pick it up if you're absolutely fiending for a mediocre 10-hour experience, or wait for a decent sale if it's a passing interest. Other than that, all I can say is it's okay.